Hello everyone, welcome to this EHDEN webinar. Welcome back if you've watched some of the webinars before. My name is Kees van Bokhoven, I'm the founder of The Hive. I'm sorry for the slight delay in starting this webinar. I'm here in the studio, as you can see, in Gorinchem, Netherlands. But we're just connecting with Seamus via Skype. And well, as you all know, technology, even right now today, it's sometimes not working. However, I will go ahead and introduce the webinar topics and also make a few references to our previous ones, while we hopefully get Seamus online in the meantime. So today's conversation is about health technology assessment. We've already had previous conversations, for example, the last one with Ismail Geugenir from Denmark. Ismail is a surgeon, and he explained us how he wants to use OMOP and OHDSI to optimize treatment decisions and actually use it within the care process. Taking even a step further back today, we want to investigate how and when the decision is made to actually submit medicines to the market, specifically to the UK healthcare market. A very important role in this process plays NICE, which is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which is the institute that provides guidance for any medicines that entered the UK market. And Seamus will hopefully tell us all about the difference between the different types of guidance that NICE provides. But first, I understand that Seamus is online now. Maybe you can introduce yourself and also the organization you work for.
Apologies first for the technical difficulties. So I'm Seamus. I'm a scientific advisor at NICE. NICE is the health technology assessment agency in England, who have a variety of roles. Key among them is in forming clinical guidelines, which is about how to prevent certain conditions, how to diagnose them, and ultimately how to treat them, and also issuing guidance in relation to specific new medical technologies. These can be pharmaceuticals, interventional procedures, medtech, and a variety of things. But just before we get into that in a bit more detail, to talk about me and what I do in NICE. So I work in what's called the science and research team, and our role is essentially to help NICE respond to sort of current and forthcoming challenges in this field, whether that's because of new types of medical technologies. So at the moment here, there's a lot of discussion around histology independent drugs, or because of new methods or types of data or so on. And I think this work that we're going to talk about today, real world data, probably falls into that second. And as a team, we're involved in quite a number of different European projects, including EHDEN.
Right. Thanks. So the audience, I would like to very much welcome you to pose any questions that you have in the GoToMeeting question box. We will take them as they come in, and hopefully it will help us to steer the conversation in a direction that also interests you. One of the key topics we had scheduled to talk about is the role of health technology assessment, first of all. Seamus, just in layman's terms, can you explain what is involved in medicines entering the UK market? Let's focus for drugs on the moment.
Yeah, so I think lots of the audience who are outside the HTA world will be familiar with the sort of standard regulatory processes that you need to establish that new medicine is of high quality, it's effective, and it's safe, sort of in relation to that efficacy. But that's not necessarily enough to get a drug actually used widely within the healthcare system. So in England and in many other countries through Europe and elsewhere, there is what's sometimes called the fourth hurdle, which is health technology assessment. And there, what we're really trying to do is understand a bit more about the relative effectiveness of interventions. So rather than proving that they're effective in comparison to, say, a placebo, this is about trying to show that they're effective in relation to the current best standard of care that is available. Some bodies also think about cost effectiveness. So are additional costs of a new drug, for example, are they justified by the additional health benefits that we derive by using that drug? So this is kind of predicated on the idea, the economic concept of opportunity cost, and that means that if we spend our limited healthcare resources on one particular technology, we can't spend that same money somewhere else. So we need to try and make sure that we are getting the most value in terms of patient health from that expenditure. So there's these kind of methods, relative effectiveness assessments and cost effectiveness assessments. And different bodies in Europe kind of take different approaches to this. I think it's worth saying that HTA is a bit more broad than just this. So when we're evaluating a new technology, relative effectiveness and cost effectiveness are key inputs.
Right. Sorry, I just lost you there for a moment, Seamus, but maybe you can actually comment on the different countries in Europe a bit more. So what you said is you made a difference between just looking at the effectiveness or efficacy of a treatment versus also taking into account the costs of that treatment and optimizing kind of both components together. So how do we get the most bang for the buck in terms of improving patients' lives and improving quality of life?
Yeah, so the exact frameworks to try and achieve that differ a little bit across countries in Europe. In UK, we use a framework called the cost per quality framework. So we try to estimate the additional benefits of new technology in terms of quality adjusted life years. And this is a measure which combines both the length of life that a new technology will deliver to patients and the quality of those additional years of life. So this is a measure which allows us to compare between different technologies and different disease areas, using a single concept. And then we compare these additional benefits to the additional costs. And these are not just these are the costs of the new drug or the new medical device, but they're also the sort of indirect effects because of a particular drug might mean that people need to go to the hospital less because they have lower rates of myocardial infarctions, for example, depending on the drug. So we try and take into account all these downstream effects of a medication and weigh them up.
Okay. Can you give an example of how that works for a certain disease area, let's say COPD or prostate cancer? So how do you even approach that problem?
Yeah, so it can be, because what we're often interested in is these long-term impacts of technology. So often we want to go beyond the kind of short time horizon of clinical trials to the lifetime of the patient. And this is particularly true in say, COPD, which is a chronic disease. So often in HTA, what we end up doing is economic modeling. And this is where you kind of try and generate a kind of like abstract model of the disease process. So in terms of COPD, we might think about how the condition progresses over time. So lung function starts relatively high and will deteriorate over time at some rate. So what we'll do is use models which have defined states. So it'll be different levels of lung function. And we look at how people transition between these states over time, and they accumulate health measured perhaps in QALYs, as I've mentioned already, and costs over time. What we'll then do, so we'll kind of simulate essentially patient experience over their lifetime, and then try and estimate what the impact is of changes to particular transition probabilities on the long-term health consequences and the long-term cost consequences of that treatment.
Right. So I'm not sure if it's possible to get that model up on the screen for a moment for our viewers, but
yeah, I shall try.
Okay. In any case,
are they able to see that?
yeah, I can see it, Seamus.
Okay.
I think that means the audience can see
Okay.
it as
Yeah, so this schematic, which is up on the screen, should help clarify this, make it a little bit less abstract. So what this does is represents or provides a simplified representation of the disease process in COPD. This is realized through defining distinct health states. In this case, this is based on lung function through GOLD staging, and also people's history of COPD exacerbations. These arrows that you see between these different states, they indicate which transitions are possible. So transitions happen at specified time intervals. What this is depends on your particular application. It might be 1 month if people can move quite regularly, or it might be a year in many chronic diseases. And each of these states has an associated health-related quality of life as well as cost. And as people kind of move through this model, they accumulate this quality of life, additional years of life,
okay.
and healthcare
So
costs.
yeah, I can understand that you have this model where you have different states in terms of the progression of disease, so from mild to moderate, and I can also imagine that someone with severe COPD, there is a bigger health impact than someone with moderate or light COPD. But how do possible treatments come into this equation? So, are you evaluating, for example, whether a drug or a treatment, a device can help people to stay in a state, or how does that work? That interaction between sort of the disease pathway and the treatments?
So interventions can work in a number of ways. Usually they kind of follow the direction of the RCT evidence. If you take this example in COPD, we might think of a drug as impacting on the decline of lung function. It might be able to slow it down, or it might affect the risk of COPD exacerbations. And the impact is seen on these outcomes by affecting these transition probabilities, which are depicted by the arrows, and then we can simulate the long-term impact of these changes in transition probabilities on quality adjusted life years and healthcare costs. So I also have a generalized example in oncology, and this is a model with 3 states: people who have not progressed, people who have progressed, and then finally death. And usually, and you can see the transitions between these health states depicted again by those arrows. And we might think of a treatment effect either affecting time to progression or the risk of death following progression.
Curiosity, why is there an arrow going out from the dead state?
So the arrow that loops back on itself in the death state, that simply tells you that that's the only transition possible. It's there really for completeness, just to say that people remain in that state once they've reached it.
Progression free and post progression, but I'm not sure I fully got it. So, what exactly is the difference there?
Well, this is something which depends on the specific cancer in which you're interested. Often it might be something like a clinical biomarker that indicates progression, and often this might be the sort of surrogate outcome of a randomized controlled trial. one example in prostate cancer may be that you define progression by the level of PSA in the blood.
Right. So and then the relation that you make with regards to treatments is that if let's say a drug for prostate cancer can help sort of maintain these PSA levels in a stable state, that means in your model that they keep being in this progression-free box.
Yeah, I think really what it's important to really emphasize is that RCTs are often relatively short in duration, and we're interested in sort of the lifetime consequences of the intervention on the patients. So we're really using this tool as a means of extrapolating these outcomes over the long term.
Okay, so for the audience, I hope you're still with us. I didn't see a question come in yet, but feel free to ask them. I want to progress a bit further into EHDEN and OMOP in the relation with HTA. But before we do that, Seamus, you also mentioned a couple minutes back that there is this difference between sort of just modeling quality of life and disease status versus also taking into account the costs, and how this is on a societal level almost a choice that you have to make. Do you allow sort of a free market, or do you allow doctors to decide what they want to prescribe, or do you actually on a national level, you can do this in the UK because of the healthcare system that you have, that okay, we will only actually reimburse treatments if the balance between the gains in terms of health and the costs of the medicines is right, if that balance is worth it.
Yeah.
So can you comment on how that differs between countries in Europe and maybe give some examples?
In the UK, we have a single payer system with the NHS.
And the way that NICE guidance works in relation to pharmaceuticals is that there's a funding mandate. So if we recommend, or if NICE recommends a technology, the NHS has to make the money available to fund that technology within 3 months. And obviously, so if you take Germany as an example, they have a social health insurance system, but they still kind of have national level decision making. You have a body, it's called the Joint Federal Committee, or GBA, and they help try and decide what should be in essentially the statutory health insurance funds, what treatment should be provided within that. So there are a lot of similarities across European countries, despite the kind of differences in the healthcare systems. Germany evaluates technologies in a somewhat different way to NICE. So NICE has this focus on cost effectiveness analysis, whereas Germany looks at relative effectiveness analysis and doesn't typically include costs or take costs into account beyond the kind of price of that medication. In Germany as well, the one major difference is that this HTA process, so the evaluation of the additional benefits of the technology, is actually used to help negotiate the price that technology will be reimbursed at within the statutory health insurance funds. Whereas in the UK, NICE doesn't actually have a mandate to negotiate prices of medications or other technologies. It's essentially a price taker. The negotiations will be done with NHS England, and NICE decides based on the submitted price whether a technology represents good value for money for the healthcare system. And actually most countries in Europe do use HTA to inform pricing decisions and not just reimbursement decisions like in the UK.
Interesting, but there is still pricing discussions being done. It's just by NHS in that case in the UK then. And is that
That's right.
before sort of you run your models, or is it more a cross talk between NHS and NICE?
Yeah, it can be before, but it also happens at specific points through the process of evaluation. So there's an opportunity during this process for companies to go back and agree, say, discount rates with NHS England, which will then be taken into account when NICE comes to, or the committee's NICE forms comes to make decisions about the reimbursement of that technology.
Right. So when preparing for this webinar, I took a look around on the NICE website, and I noticed that you essentially have these categories of guidance and also guidelines. Can you comment a little bit more on what the distinction is there, and what role these both play in healthcare?
Yeah, they are quite different. So guidelines are about trying to map out, to help inform healthcare professionals how to, if you take a particular disease area like cardiovascular disease, these guidelines will talk about prevention of cardiovascular disease, diagnosis of disease, and ultimately treatment of disease. And they'll try and cover that whole clinical process. Whereas the guidance, and it's a slightly, if you're not familiar with it, the distinction I'm sure is somewhat confusing. But the guidance is typically about specific new healthcare technologies, whether that's a drug that's just got or is expected to get EMA marketing approval, or a new medical device, and so on. And then these guidances, they make recommendations pertaining to these specific technologies, rather than thinking about the entire care process.
Right. So these.
But perhaps an important thing important point to make is that often the methods in terms of the kind of data that we need to inform these decisions, whether they're for guidelines or for guidance, are quite similar. And the potential benefits, which we'll come on to talking about EHDEN soon, but the potential value of this framework apply equally to clinical guidelines and the evaluation of new technologies.
Right. Okay, so the guidelines describe more the typical sort of treatment pathway, or rather the decision process that the clinicians take, right? So for example, in the Netherlands, there is this cancer institute called IKNL, and they made sort of interactive decision maps where you can put, let's say, in the case of prostate cancer, a PSA value, and it then shows you, okay, then you go do this diagnosis or assessment, or here's where you give this drug. As well, in the OMOP-CDM community, actually recently we integrated an oncology working group, and also in the main OHDSI vocabularies, something called HEMONC, and this is actually a wiki which describes very nicely for various oncology indications what sort of the typical treatments are, and when those are triggered. Because especially in oncology, this has become quite a complex field where really there's so many treatments and biomarkers that, you know, as an oncologist, it's a lot of work to keep up with the latest developments and the latest research. And so this is also where your guidelines from NICE actually help to sort of advise people on the ground with the latest knowledge. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably important to note that they are guidelines, so they're not, in the way that I talked about this mandated funding for new technologies. Guidelines don't have that same mandate associated with them, so they leave plenty of room for clinician discretion and so on.
And so guidance is more when, let's say, you know, a BMS or Merck or J&J or Roche or whoever puts a new oncology drug on the market, and they claim that if you combine it with this biomarker and in this indication, then we see an increase in survival, and that's where then you as NICE come in, and you actually sort of check these assumptions, and you put out very precise guidance out that, yes, we recommend in this case to use the drug, or maybe not use because we don't see that much improvement, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think perhaps it's worth noting as well that typically at NICE anyway, for these kinds of appraisals, the company submitting will typically provide or perform economic studies themselves, this long-term modeling and so on, and they'll provide the evidence to NICE, which is then assessed by a sort of independent academic body before being put through to a committee who make the decisions. And this is relevant, I think, because when we come on to EHDEN, it's relevant to who this EHDEN framework might be useful to. So as well as being useful to HTA bodies who need to interpret evidence, and in some cases, generate evidence, for example, in guidelines. We tend to do guidelines in-house rather than externally, but also to companies who actually need to submit this evidence to NICE and other HTA bodies.
Okay, so interesting. So this distinction that you make now is that you say that the pharma company, essentially the onus is on them to demonstrate efficacy of the drug, that it actually works and does perform a function. And you as NICE have more, let's say, a controlling, or you're checking the evidence that's provided to you rather than doing the research yourself.
Yeah, that's largely true. I mean, they're more than just the effectiveness. They also need to demonstrate sort of relative effectiveness, so in relation to a relevant comparator. So and also cost effectiveness.
Relative effectiveness compared to treatments that are already reimbursed, already available. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that's interesting. So how you use these models that you were showing before to sort of assess that? Is there also, I'm wondering how much do you actually need to know about the field when you're doing that work? For example, do you have to be an expert in molecular biology and really know about these biomarkers and what is the latest research when you're doing this in oncology, or what is the sort of checks that you do or not do as NICE?
In collaboration with many different people with many different backgrounds, clinical backgrounds, and so on. So there's always people who are involved who have a very good understanding of the clinical side, of the statistics side, and health economics. They're multidisciplinary teams trying to evaluate these technologies and these submissions.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So you collaborate with universities for that, or who is in that multidisciplinary team?
Well, yeah. So to go back to the case where. Are you talking about the kind of guidance at the moment, or the guidelines?
Oh, okay.
Just to clarify.
Yes. So let's take the guidance.
Yeah. So a company will have developed a model and provide the evidence, and then we have analysts at NICE who will assess this, and this is a multidisciplinary team, and then we'll also send it to what's called an evidence review group at a university typically. And they will be able to provide additional expertise, particularly around the modeling side. Then the committees who actually make the decision, this will include clinicians, patients, members of the public can attend, and so on.
Right. So some of you in the audience may be familiar with the Book of OHDSI. If you're not, then I would definitely recommend checking it out. And in the Book of OHDSI, there is a number of chapters which pertain to the quality of evidence, and also you can distinguish that in sort of, well, how good is the data quality, also the analysis, is the statistical analysis that was chosen appropriate for the hypothesis that you're testing. I'm not sure, Seamus, in what extent you've looked in sort of what's available in the OHDSI community today in terms of data quality dashboards and also analysis algorithms that are available. But when you think about your work at NICE, which of those aspects, so data analysis, would you really say you focus on when assessing evidence and producing these guidance documents?
So, I mean, to clarify the question, are you asking about how these components of OHDSI might be of value within the kind of work that we do?
Yeah, I'm just trying to visualize. So you have a drug application, right? And with that is evidence that's provided, typically in the form of a randomized controlled trial. Maybe there's some biomarkers involved in that. Now, what do you do exactly as NICE and this team? Do you sort of rerun the analysis? Do you only just add the cost element? Can you explain a bit more, just in sort of layman's terms, what's being done?
No, so I think I'll go back a bit, and I think it's in a sense it's good to try and keep it as slightly more general level rather than NICE has a particular process, but it's good to think about the kind of evidence that you need for this kind of work in general. And it's not just about the effectiveness. So we need, in order to populate these models and understand the lifetime impact of these health technologies, we typically use data on effectiveness from RCTs, but we need to try and estimate or understand this sort of natural course of disease over time. So for this, we'll need to use all sorts of registries, observational databases, electronic medical records, and so on, and understand the health-related quality of life impact of these different stages of disease or events, and the healthcare use or healthcare costs that are associated with this. And specifically in the case of NICE and its evaluation of medicines, all this evidence will be generated by the company who is submitting, and NICE will try and evaluate it to understand whether it's likely to be valid, accurate, reliable, and so on.
Okay. So what you're saying is that you not only actually need to look at the RCT, but you're actually placing this in a much broader context of sort of also what would be the natural history of the disease, or what would be the typical progression. How is that with today's sort of standards of care? So there's a much broader context than just the RCT evidence that you're looking at. And you also commented on that you need a lot of different types of data to sort of create and understand this context. Maybe it's good to go over that a bit further, because this is actually where I think the link with OMOP-CDM and EHDEN becomes quite clear. What are the sources that you use, the data sources, to create this picture?
Yeah, so typically for our evidence and effectiveness, we do rely quite heavily on randomized controlled trials, but there are situations in which we don't have such evidence. So we might have trials based on single-arm evidence, or the trials might not include the kind of patients that will actually be treated in practice. They might not follow up patients for sufficiently long. So we can use various types of data, real-world data sources, to try and extend these results beyond what's observed within the trials. But as I say, typically we use RCTs for effectiveness. But when we think about about understanding kind of the natural course of a disease, we're interested in all sorts of epidemiological data. So to go back to the lung function example, COPD example, we need to understand this sort of general decline in lung function over time, impacted on by different treatments. We need to know what the rate of exacerbation events are over time based on your stage of respiratory disease severity. And we need to understand the healthcare impacts of exacerbation. So If people have exacerbations, they need to use particular kinds of drugs to help control those. They are likely to end up going to hospital. They might see their GP or their primary care physician or have outpatient attendances more often. And we need to capture this in order to understand sort of the full picture regarding this treatment or this intervention.
Right. So if we take one of the examples that you mentioned, understanding how the lung function sort of naturally declines over time, what sort of data sources would you look into to answer that question?
Yeah. So I mean, what NICE would often do is refer to the previous literature to see if it's well understood how lung function declines, and where if it was deemed that there was more evidence necessary, in that case you would tend to need. You could use something like disease registry data if you had it with regard to lung function, where you observed spirometry measurements at certain intervals over time, and then you could try and model the change in function over time. You can also do this potentially with electronic health records if there's good data on spirometry measurements.
Right.
If you take the exacerbations as an example, you need information on hospitalizations. So you would want to get that kind of data. So in England, this would be through hospital episode statistics typically, and potentially through some primary care databases where they link to this information.
Right. And this data can come from the UK. I imagine in some cases it's important because I mean your mission is of course first I guess to the United Kingdom, but I would suppose that in many situations it's also interesting to look at data from other European countries or even worldwide, globally. So can you comment on that for the data that NICE would use? Where do you get it from?
Yeah, I mean there is probably a preference for UK data, particularly if you're looking at healthcare utilization. We have a particular type of healthcare system, a particular way of delivering care. So if you're trying to capture the impact of a technology on healthcare use, it often needs to be, very relevant to the jurisdiction in which you're trying to create that data for. But if you're trying to understand more sort of epidemiological aspects of a disease, like natural decline in lung function over time or rates of serious adverse events, it might be that it's reasonable where the data is not available from the UK or in sufficient numbers available from the UK to use countries. And indeed, I mean, particularly around effectiveness data, we'll often consider evidence from randomized control trials that have been conducted in countries outside the UK. Because they're deemed to be fairly generalizable to some extent.
Right. Okay, so let's link that into OMOP and especially the EHDEN project for a bit. So for the viewers that just tuned in for this webinar and don't know a lot about what EHDEN is, it's a European project, European Health Data and Evidence Network. And our goal is to build a federated network in Europe of health data sources, which can be of all types. It can be, primary care practices or groups of primary care type practices typically. It can be hospitals. It can be pharmacies. It can be specialized disease registries or cohort studies. And what we do engaging with all these, we call them data partners, which have some sort of custodianship on healthcare data, is that we help them to map this data to a common model called the OMOP Common Data Model. And in a model, which if you're interested in the details, you can have a look at a few of the previous webinars, for example, the first one with Danny Prieto from Oxford University. We have standardized tables to indicate patient visits and drugs and procedures, measurements, etc., as well as standardized vocabularies. so that we can actually compare healthcare data from different sources in a similar way. Of course, there are a lot of details coming into data quality, and we addressed some of that as well in one of our previous webinars, both the one with Ismail, but also the one on with CDAP, a Spanish primary care database. Let's return with this small sort of intro on EHDEN and OMOP to HTA. Seamus, you already explained that even though you're using primarily UK data, you need sort of all the help you can get into creating this disease landscape and understanding how treatments could affect that, and also what the cost component of that is. So how do you think EHDEN and OMOP can actually help and assist HTA?
Yeah, so that's right. We do have quite substantial evidence requirements for HTA, and we often, undertaking any particular analysis, will often have to look to multiple data sets in order to get relevant information. You know, no one data set may contain everything that you're interested in, so you often have to use multiple data sets, or you may have insufficient numbers from a data set and need to use others, or you want to translate results across different settings. So EHDEN and OMOP can have sort of a number of quite valuable roles in trying to facilitate this. And I think it's kind of important to distinguish between these different components of EHDEN. So you have this federated data network, and that's about that would help kind of the identification of appropriate data sets and potentially help facilitate access to these data sets. Of course, you still have to go through the sort of usual data access processes, but it helps you understand what's available. And then you have the common data model itself, the common structure and common vocabularies. And this makes it much easier because you can write a script on a single database, or on synthetic data even, and then apply it potentially at speed to multiple databases in order to generate the evidence that's relevant to you. It also helps, and then you have the kind of last component, which is the standardized analytical tools through OHDSI. And these, again, simplify analysis, they make it quicker, but they also, as well as the common data model, they also make analyses more transparent, because it's easier for those reviewing what's been done, as HTA bodies are often required to do. It's easier to evaluate any analyses undertaken when they're using these kind of these tools. So that helps with transparency.
Right. So I don't think we have any questions from the audience at this point. So either it's super clear what you're explaining, Seamus, or we've lost you already, which would not be good. But I'm just going to go optimistically with the first. It's very clear what you're explaining. And I think actually that what you just said about the role of EHDEN, it's essentially true for evidence in general, right? And this is a very big component of the OHDSI community, that we want to improve the quality of medical evidence. And in EHDEN, I think the operational component here is that a very big part of quality of evidence is just simply repeating the analysis in more data sources, because there's a lot of bias problems that could potentially be there. And so repeating that same query or analysis in multiple databases gives you just a better confidence in evidence. Do you also see other factors in terms of what EHDEN could bring for improving the confidence of evidence? For example, you mentioned already a few things, but what about data quality? Like, how do you assess when you from let's say a NICE standpoint, whether you even want to use a certain database for evidence generation?
Yeah, that's a good question. When NICE is trying to build its guidelines, it does have a relatively, for much of the evidence, it has a few data sets which it tries to use quite regularly. These are UK primary care data sets, hospital episode statistics, which are sort of reasonably well validated, and at least the strengths and weaknesses of those data sets are well understood. But often you'll get submissions or where they've used data sets which you won't be so familiar with, and it can be quite difficult to really understand about what this means for the validity and accuracy of the evidence which is submitted. So I think anything which would provide a better understanding of data quality would be very useful. It would allow NICE to have a much better understanding of the quality of the evidence that's submitted to it.
Right. Yeah. Which reminds me that we may also want to zoom in at some point on the actual data. Maybe that's a nice topic for a future webinar, to actually look into CPRD and HAS, because that combination is quite often used by people. But I do think there is even a lot to say about that. For example, so CPRD has actually multiple data sets, and they cover also different sets of GP practices in the UK. So it's not necessarily all of UK's GP data. Plus, it's useful, I think, inherently useful to also look into other health systems, like the previous conversation that I had with CDAP, which is a Spanish GP database, to kind of rerun the same analysis there as well. I think still no questions, so maybe Seamus, if you could focus a little bit more on sort of the future state, because you mentioned how EHDEN and OMOP could possibly help in evidence generation, but where do you think we could go in, say, 5 years? Whenever we have EHDEN up and running, there's the network. What impact would that have, and specifically for an institution like NICE?
Well, I think NICE itself is trying to get a bit more grips with sort of the data and analytics world, and understanding how it can make better use of data. Currently, it does very little data analysis in-house, and where it needs to do stuff, it works with partners. So I think this could be of value there, because they're, as you say, often sort of there's very few data sets which will contain all the information you want. So you always have to be using multiple databases. So this network, these kind of standardized tools really support that. But for NICE, I think it's not just about evidence generation itself, but it's also about the ability to validate what's been done by other groups, whether that's because the tools are transparent, or because it means they can actually run code on other data sets, which they can access either in-house or through the federated data network of EHDEN. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot more to understand about how EHDEN will be useful for HTA. There's definitely going to be elements that are challenging, particularly around trying to estimate costs. There's issues around quality of life. I mean, in theory, the common data models supports quality of life measurements, and that's correct. But quality of life measurements are often missing in observational databases. So that's a kind of broader problem. And then lots of the kinds of analyses that we typically perform within economic evaluation or HTA, things like parametric survival modeling or time to event modeling. These aren't things which are currently supported by the OHDSI tools. So it's about trying to further understand how these tools can be developed to be of most use in HTA as well.
So we have a question coming in from Pal Johnson, and he asks, what would you say are the pros and cons of using OMOP map data, so as we would have it available in EHDEN, versus actually just using the source data?
Yeah, I think you probably have some views on that yourself. I mean, it partly depends on the situation. The fact that data is mapped can make analyses much easier in certain circumstances. So if you take CPRD as an example, clinical events recorded using read codes, and you can have a huge number of read codes depicting any a relatively any single clinical event like type 2 diabetes or clinical condition, I should say. Um, and the mapping of these concepts to the SNOMED vocabulary within the OMOP common data model simplifies the analysis substantially. And then once you've written the code and performed the analysis on a particular data set, you can then transfer that code to another data set and derive the results from there. So using this map data means that you have a much wider array of data at your disposal. There are obviously challenges posed by that mapping process as well, and I think part of the EHDEN project and the OHDSI community in general is always trying to understand whether there is information loss and the extent of that information loss when mapping that data. And that's kind of an ongoing question and depends on the type of data you're looking at, the particular data set, and so on.
Use, and it goes back to kind of the topic we touched earlier on just using multiple data sources to sort of increase your level of confidence. I think we're almost coming to the end of the webinar. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but did you have other things maybe yourself that you want to share? Or if not, I would have a few still, like for example, what's the relation with EMA? Yeah, up to you, Seamus, what you want to take.
Yeah, I mean, I'd quite like to say that some people might watch this later, so may not watch it live, or may have other questions that they haven't put through the GoToMeeting. And if people are interested in this, particularly around its role in HTA and have thoughts on it and want to discuss them or make comments, I would invite them to contact me. I'd be really happy to hear from people at any point. And as part of this project, we also want to start engaging with other HTA bodies to make sure that we're taking into account not just the perspective of NICE, but others as well. So I'd be very just inviting people to get in contact with me.
Right. So I just want to underline one thing that you said a minute ago, maybe before we close, Seamus. So you said that you see a number of things that are not really so prominent yet in OMOP and OHDSI, but that would be very interesting to further develop from an HTA perspective, especially sort of the health economics components and cost tables in the model, as well as some of the analytics that come with health technology assessment. So I would really look forward to sort of either within EHDEN or in the broader OHDSI community to work with you and others from the HTA field to develop that further. And I would also like to sort of underline your message that in case anyone watching this later wants to work with the EHDEN project on this, please feel free to either reach out to Seamus or reach out to EHDEN in general. We are available via Twitter, we have a website, and there's also email addresses on there where you can reach us. So with that, Seamus, I want to thank you very much for your presence here today. With some technical difficulties, but we got there. I think we had a very good conversation. And
yeah, apologies for that. I was warned that trying to do these kind of things here isn't always a resounding success, but I hope enough of what I had to say came across.
Absolutely. And thank you most of all to our audience, our viewers, without which this webinar wouldn't be so much fun as it was today. Thank you, and till next time. Bye.